Order. Good morning and welcome to this meeting of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. We returned this morning to our inquiry on the work of the Department and its arm's length bodies. Good morning, Secretary of State. Welcome back to the committee. You're the first person we've brought back. So good to see you, good to have you with us. Can I invite you, just briefly, for the benefit of those who are following our proceedings and for our own record, to introduce yourself and your colleagues?
I'm Steve Reid, I'm the Secretary of State at DEFRA.
David Hill, I'm the Director General Strategy and Water at DEFRA.
Emily Miles, Director General for Food, Biosecurity and Trade at DEFRA. Okay,
well, good morning. You are all very welcome. Secretary of State, I want to start with a few questions around yesterday's summit. As you might expect, your department, it will have some wide-reaching implications. First of all, what role did you have in the negotiations leading up to the summit yesterday?
Well, I did suspect this issue might come up.
We know that it was Nick Thomas-Symonds in the Cabinet Office who led it, but where were you in the whole picture?
I wasn't part of the negotiating team, clearly. However, there were conversations that we all participated in around our particular areas, pushing the outcomes that we were looking for, many of which were achieved, some of which were not. But in the round, I think this is a really good deal for the sector. It comes on the back, of course, of the US and India trade deals, and have all three within just about 2 weeks of each other. This is a huge boost for the UK agri-food and food and drink sectors, particularly since food exports and drink exports since 2018 have declined by 21% from the UK into the European Union. And this is a real chance to reset that, get our good British food exports moving across the border again, money into the businesses here that need it to grow and to thrive, to create new jobs and to pay their own people securely for the future. I think it's a really good outcome.
I think you'll find there's a fair degree of agreement around the table in relation to that. One of the areas, though, that's feeling a bit aggrieved this morning is the fishing industry. Why did you bring in fishing into these negotiations when, in fact, you've got another year before the TCA review really needed to happen? Was that not just signalling a willingness to trade fishing off against other areas?
Well, I think it would be very damaging indeed for that sector, and for any, as it would be for any sector, to just be living year to year with no certainty about what's going to happen into the future. I think this is a reasonably good deal for the UK fishing sector. Compared to what some of the speculation was, and indeed some of the pressures on our negotiating team, the EU were interested in more quota, more access to EU territorial waters. They were looking for a deal on fishing in perpetuity, and they were trying to achieve that by making what I felt was a spurious link between fishing and an SPS deal. Our negotiating team held absolutely firm. And as a result of that, we have a deal for 12 years, which if you compare to what the fishing sector has had for the last few years, we're rolling over the best of the years that the fishing sector has had under the previous government's deal. So it's better than every single year under the current arrangements until the final year to 2026, and then that is rolled forward for 12 years. So no loss at all of quota or our own access into territorial waters, but there are further benefits as well, because the UK fishing sector exports 70% of our catch into Europe. That has now become much easier, much simpler, much less costly, so they can export more of our British fish across the border. Less of it is likely to rot at the borders. And of course, I'll just make this one final point if I may, but we've been pushing for a very long time for live bivalve molluscs to be exported back into Europe, and they will be. So there is no downside to this for fishers. There's a big upside in what they can export. And of course, we announced at the same time the new Fishing and Coastal Growth Fund, which over the period of the deal is worth £360 million. That will be allocated in close consultation and engagement with the fishing sector itself. They've made criticisms of a previous fund that the previous government introduced because it did not work with or for the sector. We will be co-producing it with the sector so that it meets precisely what they need to take advantage of the wider opportunities that this deal presents for the UK fishing sector.
Well, I mean, you say it's a good deal. The Chief Executive of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation said, and I quote, "It's a horror show." Said it highlights the total indifference of the British political establishment to the interests of our fishing sector, with Sir Keir becoming the third Prime Minister after Edward Heath and Boris Johnson to betray the industry. The National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations said that they were very disappointed with today's deal and its impact on fishermen and their communities. They wrong?
Very respectfully, I completely disagree with them. I think given that we could have been sat here this morning talking about a reduction in UK quotas, increased access of UK vessels into UK territorial waters, no investment fund for those communities, and potentially, had there not been the kind of deal that we've got, no increased ability in the ease of exporting into the European Union. That's what we could have been facing. So I think this is a fair deal for the fishing sector. They've lost nothing compared to what they have at the moment, but they've gained easier access into the EU markets, and we can now export items of shellfish that previously we couldn't.
If they had been happy with Boris Johnson's deal, that would be one thing. But you've rolled it over, you've locked it in for another 12 years. So they were looking for exclusive access to the 0 to 12 nautical mile zone for UK fishing vessels. They wanted to maintain the UK's regulatory autonomy in matters relating to the management of fisheries within its waters, and improve collaboration on the sustainable and equitable management of non-quota species. So you've made no progress in any of these things at all. In fact, you've locked them into a deal where that's all off the table for another 12 years.
Well, I mean, you'll appreciate, and I'm sure they do too, this was a negotiation. So we, of course, pushed for more, but it's a negotiation. I have to say, I would have liked it if we'd got even more for them. We did push hard. I engaged with the two bodies that you've referred to ahead of the negotiations, and I fed their views in. But at the end of the day, I still think this is a good deal. I mean, we've retained regulatory autonomy. There is no return to the common fishing policy of the European Union. Take the issue of sand eels, for instance. We've retained our autonomy and our position on that. So in the round, and that's how you have to judge these things, this is a good deal standing on its own for fish. But if you look at the wider impact on the economy, it's a huge boost, and the fishing sector, because of course they want to sell their fish, some of it, into the UK economy. If the economy is thriving, people are going to buy more of their produce. It's a good deal.
This has been the history of fisheries since we're into the common market. They get traded off against something else. By taking it forward into this year's negotiation, instead of leaving it as a standalone, you invited that compromise, and they will tell you that that is what has happened again. But you mentioned sand eels there. We've had the arbitration decision, which I think was generally pretty welcome. Does that embolden you in thinking that there are other things you can do for different fisheries? In particular, I'm thinking of gill netting, industrial scale gill netting, one of the most unsustainable practices that you will find anywhere. Is that something that you would now move on in terms of what we allow within our territorial waters?
Well, as I say, we have retained regulatory autonomy as part of this deal, and I'm broadly pleased with where we got to on sand eels. The outcome has been largely in our favour. I think that's to be welcomed. And then, of course, we will look at other species as well, where we think there is action to be taken. But just to address your first point, I do want to really emphasise this point, because you said fishing was traded out in this deal. It wasn't. They've lost absolutely nothing, and they've gained things, particularly access, that we did not have before. And on top of that,
that's
for those
market
communities,
access, not fishing access.
General access,
Yeah.
I mean access into the European markets,
Yeah.
of course, for exports. And in addition to that, the Fishing and Coastal Growth Fund is worth £360 million specifically for the fishing communities in those coastal areas. I'd say again, this is a good deal for fish, although we pushed for more. It's a good deal, but in the round, it benefits the entire economy, and that, of course, includes the fishing sector.
We are under pressure of time. We've got a lot to get through today, so while I would love to carry on talking fish, I'm going to move on to other stuff. The SPS agreement, a future SPS agreement with the EU includes dynamic alignment with exceptions. What will this alignment look like, and what exceptions do you expect to be included?
Well, the alignment that we are looking for and have secured as part of this deal is to reduce trade friction at the border. The reasons for doing that are it protects thousands of jobs in our economy, helps to create new jobs in our economy, and means we can export more of our good, high-quality British produce across the border and sell it into that vast European market that's right on our doorstep. I was very struck by a little example that I read in the press this morning. Simon Sporrell, a cheesemaker, who had to close his business 4 years ago because he was incurring £600,000 losses under the previous Brexit deal, because if he was sending £35 worth of his good British cheese to a customer in the European Union, they had to pay £180 checks on that product. It's simply undoable, and by getting this different deal, we have removed the need for those checks, removed that cost, and he's thinking of opening his business up again. That is a difference it makes to British entrepreneurs, British businesses who can now get their food across the border. And you would think every single party in this Parliament would welcome the fact that this is good for business and good for trade. Where we're seeking exceptions, and there are still negotiations going on around this, for instance, on precision breeding, gene editing, whichever terminology you want to use, I want to see our farming sector benefit from the potential higher productivity, higher yields that can come from using that technology. We are somewhat ahead of the European Union in regulations.
How achievable now are your aspirations on precision breeding, gene editing? Your aspirations that you announced earlier in the year on precision breeding and gene editing, if we're aligned again with
we're continuing with the legislation. Mm-hmm. If you've seen the deal, you'll see that the door remains open to an agreement around that. So that's what we're working towards. That's what I'm optimistic we will achieve. But it's an important part of the wider programme I've got to increase profitability in the farming sector. If we can increase yields, then everything else being equal, we increase profitability for the farming sector. Now, of course, there will be issues in relation to the European Union as to what can and cannot be exported into the EU, but we're not members of the European Union. There are areas where those freedoms will benefit us, and this is one of them. So in the continuing negotiations, those conversations will continue, and the door, as you'll have seen in the agreement, remains open to that.
Right. Now, just moving on briefly to the question of border checks. Do you expect the infrastructure at the border for inspecting goods from the EU to be scaled back or even decommissioned as a result of this agreement?
Well, I'm going to call in one of my colleagues on this. I suspect that's Emily in a moment. Obviously, things will change once this deal is implemented, and it of course needs to go through a process before there's implementation. So there's time to work through this. But as part of the deal, the UK will have access to the EU's systems and databases. In particular, I'm very concerned indeed about biosecurity and the risks of any plant health or animal health diseases coming into the country. So we want to completely reassure ourselves that by access to those databases, databases and systems, we can take appropriate measures as and when we need to take it. But also, if there is an issue, as we've seen recently with foot and mouth in Germany initially and other parts of Central Europe subsequently, we need the ability to be able to act at pace in order to ensure that we remain protected from those diseases.
Emily,
so we will be
what's
looking
happening
at
with border control points?
So we will, once the deal is done, the final arrangements are sorted, we're expecting there will be a scaling back of some checks. So there will be a decommissioning of some facilities. We need to work through where and how. The consequences of having fewer checks on food coming in means that there won't need to be as many checks done at the border, so we'll need less. What we mustn't do is decrease the ability to look at illegal imports. The checks, a lot of the facilities that got built for Brexit were for trade, people who want to be compliant. So
this is properly traded, imported commercial imports, not personal use.
Yeah, exactly.
And the border target operating model, fruit and veg sector are currently gearing up for additional checks on the 1st of July. Should they continue with that?
So the question of the 1st of July is under active consideration. I think that's the phrase.
Well, I mean, we're sitting here on the 20th of May. The 1st of July is not very far away. What should they be doing? Or should they be preparing for something on the 1st of July that they're then going to have to ditch on the 1st of September?
At the moment, in law, the 1st of July checks have to come in. We're reviewing that, and we need government to agree if that's going to proceed.
Yeah. In the mean, I mean, I think the important thing to say to anybody from the sector is until they hear otherwise from government, they will be required to comply.
Yeah. But on the other hand, you can understand their anxiety that they're going to sort of make changes to their business,
That's right.
then to be told in a few months' time, well, actually, you didn't need to bother.
Yeah.
It's back to the same situation that you had with the construction of border control points in Dover and in Portsmouth, where local authorities invested a lot of money. Portsmouth case, an extra $6 million over the money they were given by the government of the day, only then to be told, no, I'm sorry, we've changed our mind, we're not going to do it.
Well, the previous government introduced an awful lot of friction at the border, having promised that they wouldn't. This deal enables us to reduce that friction so that trade can flow more easily. Completely appreciate the need for rapid information to the sector so that they can plan. But in the round, this is going to be good for importers and exporters. As I said right up front, exports declined 21%, imports declined 7% since 2018. We want our food on European shelves, and we want to be able to import the items that British people want to buy.
You want to go back to fishing for a second, and then we'll move on.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, as we discuss the fishing implications, I wanted to just bring in a practical example from my constituency, a local business that exports a lot of seafood to the EU, and at present they are paying around £200 a shipment. They have to obtain a health certificate, and often stuff gets stuck at the border, it goes off. They've actually stopped exporting some seafood as a result. Yeah. Can you tell us in practical terms what this deal, when implemented, will mean for that fishing business in my constituency?
Well, it will mean a dramatic reduction in paperwork. Export health checks will no longer be required. We're working through with the European Union the specifics of it, so they will have to wait a while those conversations continue. The deal was only signed, after all, yesterday at Lancaster House. But the intention and the effect of it will be to dramatically reduce that paperwork, get goods moving across the borders much faster, and of course, fish and seafood, highly perishable. Even a day's delay can reduce the saleability and income back to the producer. So this is going to be more money going back to businesses like the one that you're talking about. Were you indicating, David?
Yeah, just to add a couple of stats to that. So British fish products and seafood products currently subject to 100% document checks at the border, 30% of consignments subject to physical checks. All of that will go.
Okay, Sarah, did you want to go in here?
Just very quickly, Secretary of State, you mentioned about biosecurity, that you're very keen in supporting it, but I just also wanted to ask, what's actually happening now about the ban on EU products coming in for personal use into the UK? Because at the moment, from the 12th of April, there's a ban on cattle, sheep, goat and pig meat and dairy products, but when I've come in from an international European airport, there's no signage of that at all. So what are you doing on that, if it's a priority?
That remains in force. I have to say, when I came back from a flight from France, there were posters everywhere, and I was delighted to see that because it was only the day after we imposed the ban. So I thought that the speed with which the airports had acted was commendable, but it's very important that we take that action. We don't know for certain what caused the foot and mouth outbreak in 2001, but the speculation has focused around it being potentially a sandwich that somebody threw away. So it's very important.
How many of the airports have you done a check and seeing that they all, because it isn't rolled out across the board at all?
Baroness Hayman has written to all of the airports asking for them to promote.
Very quickly, I appreciate it's a letter, but a letter's not good enough in this day and age. I mean, it's taken off X as well. The post from the government got taken down, so I think there's still more to do. Can I just ask one other question? Just on the SPS, I know you're saying it's a very good agreement, but obviously it does now mean that we'll be subject to the European Court of Justice. It says that we are only able to contribute as far as we can for a member that's not part of the EU, and that we're going to have to pay an appropriate financial contribution. Are you sure and satisfied that this is going to give us the right levels of protection in this dynamic alignment?
Yeah, absolutely, I am. The European Court of Justice has a role, but it doesn't have jurisdiction over the UK. That is reserved to the UK Parliament. So it's the UK Parliament that will take any final decisions on these matters, not the European Court of Justice. It is common to the point that it exists in every international trade deal, that there is a dispute resolution mechanism. Ours reserves our regulatory autonomy and our judicial autonomy, and I think that's the right thing to have done. Now, I have heard people who have been making spurious, I think, arguments about this to try and undermine the deal. I would urge them to look at the wider economic benefits to the whole UK economy and UK businesses from being able to move forward with this deal. We've maintained regulatory autonomy, we've maintained judicial autonomy. It's a good deal.
Not sure it quite, actually, if you're going to be aligning, we are going to lose power.
Okay.
But I'll hand over to Chair.
Jane, you wanted a quick point.
Yeah, just a quick one about the Coastal Growth and Fishing Fund.
Yeah.
That works out, I think it's 30 million a year over the 12 years, which is great. But I wanted to ask, in Cornwall, for example, our shell fishermen and shellfishers all down the Fell and across Cornwall have gone bust, basically, have gone out of business because of this. Will this fund be used specifically for fishing? What will it be used for? How will they get it? And how will you go out and talk to the industry to make sure it's used in the best places for some of our smaller fishers and smaller boats rather than the big ones, which is where it went last time?
Yeah, really, really good points, and actually similar to points that were made to me by the fishing representative organisations. They're critical of a fund that was made available by the previous government because it didn't reach the fishers, and particularly the smaller fishers who needed access to it. So what I've said to the fishing sector is that we will work with them to focus this fund on enabling their members and the fishing community more widely to benefit from the opportunities that come from this deal. So the things they've said to me they're interested in are skills development and training to bring new entrants into the sector and upskill people who are already in the sector. The deployment of new technology and AI, where that can help make fishing more productive. Safety, because many of our vessels, particularly the smaller vessels, have safety standards that should be improved, that they want to improve. This fund will enable them to be able to access that. And as well as all of that, we're also working with our network of trade attaches in the European Union, in India, in the United States as well, to support our fishing sector to be able to export more of their products into these markets where they now have more access. So the intention is to support the fishing sector specifically with this funding.
Thank you.
Right, look, we're almost half an hour into the session. We're only dealt with yesterday's business.
So it was a big day, Chair.
We do have some questions in relation to other of the trade agreements. I think we'll maybe just do that in correspondence, if we may, and we'll move on then to the future of farming. So, Jane, if you want a second to gather yourself, if you can lead our questioning on that.
I was going to start with the SFI scheme. Yeah. So obviously when the current scheme was closed, there was an error. It was a computer error, it seems. A message was sent to people when they saved their draft to say they would have 6 weeks before the scheme was shut. They would be warned, and they weren't. So that scheme has now closed, but the government has now, DEFRA has now changed the position and said that those 3,000 draft applications that were still in there will now be heard and will be considered, but under slightly different terms and conditions. So my question really is, firstly, this scheme was shut quite bluntly, and that's partly why this happened. Was the money overspent, and what will the extra cost be of having to reopen these 3,000?
Now, you'll allow me, if I may, to contextualise what's happened here. We set the biggest ever budget for SFI as part of the biggest ever budget for farming and sustainable food production that we've ever had. We had been highly critical, and so had the farming sector, of the previous government for setting smaller budgets but then not getting it out the door. So they allocated money and it never left the Treasury. It didn't get into the hands of the farmers who needed it. We were highly critical of that. So my intention was, when we agreed that bigger budget, we would get it out the door and all of it would be in the hands of British farmers. And indeed, there is now more money in the hands of more farmers under this scheme than at any point under the previous government. However, when you have fully allocated a budget, you can't keep spending it.
Was there a late realisation then that the budget could be completely spent?
Well, I mean, these were very strangely designed budgets. It's the reason we're having to reform them. They were not prioritised in any way, and they were not capped. You know, it's quite strange to inherit budgets that are in that shape. I don't think, we would not have designed them in that way. So we're looking at how we reform them, and we will be working with the sector so they can be prioritised, so that there can be caps on what is available, because we don't want to have a situation where the money just goes to those who apply for it first, whereas those who may need it more then find that they don't have access. It's an important point to make. When we say we closed the scheme, these are multi-year funding contracts. So everybody that was in the scheme continues to get money. So when we closed it, it was to new applicants. Everybody in the scheme, and there are more of them than ever before, continues to be paid for multiple years. So we closed the scheme to new entrants when it became apparent that the budget that had been allocated had been fully spent. So
these extra 3,000 that were in draft and weren't originally going to be paid out and now are. Where will the cost come from to do that?
Also how it happened, because there was a notice on the online forms, a message that was sent to applicants telling them, wrongly, because it wasn't part of the scheme, that they would have 6 weeks notice before the scheme closed. We weren't aware that notice was on there. It was a legacy from a previous scheme.
And the Minister did say that, and that was why the scheme was kind of reopened.
That's
but
why
my question is, where will that money come from? Because obviously
we will find the money for that from our own budgets inside DEFRA, and I think that is the right thing. That is the right thing to do. Now, the intention that always was and remains that when we've done some work properly engaging the sector on how we need to reshape SFI for when it reopens, many of those applicants who hadn't got their application in on time, both those who were in the 6 weeks period, but there will be others who were not within that period as well, it will reopen and they will then have the opportunity to bid in. So many of them will...
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, because of course the SFI will be reopening and be redesigned. Yeah. We've had previous evidence that will be reconsidered in July. So there are a number of farmers, particularly those smaller farmers who didn't have the advice to apply initially. What is the time frame? When will that scheme be reopened for those farmers? Because they really need to make
we'll
those
provide that
applications
information as
sooner rather
soon
than
as we
later.
can. You'll appreciate we need to work through the process for reforming it, so we don't end up with a kind of uncapped, ill-defined scheme that we had before. It needs simplifying, and we need to make sure it's prioritised for those who need it the most. That will take some time. Once I've got clarity around that, then I can give you a firm deadline. I expect it to be early in the new year, is what I expect it to be.
In the new year next year.
Yeah.
Just then to ask, because we looked at this and trust has been damaged with the farmers because of this very swift closure. How will the department rebuild that trust going forward?
I think you're right. Trust has been damaged, but I would point out, with the greatest respect, and recognising that a mistake was made and that we have apologised for that as ministers, but there is now more money in the hands of more farmers under SFI than at any point under the previous government. And although the scheme was closed to new applicants, those who are in the scheme, and they're at record numbers, continue to be paid and funded under the scheme. Now, it clearly needs reform. Because of what has gone wrong with it, the fact that so many people who need access to it were not able to get access to it, and not just because of when it was closed to new applicants, but because the scheme was poorly designed in the first place. So there's a piece of work that we need to carry out. But it will reopen, and many of those applicants who didn't get their application in on time will then be able to apply under the new scheme. So they will get paid, and they will enter into multi-year agreements, just like those who are already in the scheme.
Okay, Sarah Dyke first, then Sarah Bull.
Thank you, Chair. I'm really pleased to see that around 3,000 SFI applicants are now going to be eligible. But these farmers have been left in the lurch. Obviously, there's been considerable mistakes that shouldn't have happened. Yeah. So farming takes long-term planning. So during the last couple of months, those farmers have been severely disadvantaged in their ability to plan properly. Could you assure me that those 3,000 that are in the system will be properly informed that the funding is available to them, and what timescales will be made available to ensure that funding is dropped down appropriately to them?
I will bring in my colleague, my fear is itching, to say something as well. But first of all, I've been reassured that those 3,000 have been contacted. They will be given an appropriate amount of time to make their applications. In terms of the error itself, I am very keen that there should be no repeat of that. So I have got a team working with the RPA to try and identify what went wrong in this miscommunication, so we can make sure that it doesn't happen again. And in saying that, I'm not trying to disparage anybody that works there. There are a lot of people who work very, very hard and do a fantastic job for the people that they are trying to support. But clearly something went wrong that should not have gone wrong. And I'm keen and determined that shouldn't happen again. So we are looking at what is wrong with their systems so that we can correct it. Emily.
Just to add, so for the 3,000 who are now eligible, we will be writing to them individually to let them know, and that will then give them notice that we will then write to them again to say when the application window opens. We didn't want to open the window straight away. We wanted to give everyone some notice that was the case. But that will happen, the first letter will happen imminently, and then the application window will open within a few weeks.
It just feels that there needs to be some more really proactive support for some of these farmers who will have just closed the door on it and assumed that there wasn't any funding. And my issue here that despite it being reopened, some of these farmers are going to be severely disadvantaged over the course of the last couple of months and the decisions that have been made. The other thing I wanted to cover is that just to check off, where is the money coming from for these now 3,000 farmers that will be able to re-enter into the scheme?
Well, these are multi-year contracts they're entering into. So the bulk of it, because it's for more than the current financial year, will come from future allocations under the budget for the SFI scheme. Residual elements that fall within the current year will find within the departmental budget, but I need to know, first of all, how much that is.
So that's not going to squeeze future budgets?
no, it shouldn't squeeze future budget, because the way it works is basically once you're in the schemes roll forward for multiple years. So I mean, the phrase goes that they closed SFI. It's only closed temporarily to new applicants, everybody in it, and we have a record number of farms in SFI now are all continuing to be paid in the same way that they always have been paid.
And I just picked up on something you said just a minute ago, that you said many farmers will be eligible going forward into the next schemes. Can you just clarify, when you say many farmers, is that all farmers? Well,
the reason I didn't say every single farmer is because of what I said earlier on. We inherited an uncapped, unprioritised budget. So money was allocated to it, and there was no mechanism to stop that budget being overspent. And indeed, in many previous years, it had been seriously underspent. So money that should have gone to farmers didn't go to farmers. And yet, particularly if you speak to smaller farmers, those who perhaps can't afford to pay an agent to do the application for them, they found it very difficult to access the funding. I want to make sure it's a much fairer scheme, and that those smaller farmers who don't have agents are not unnecessarily disadvantaged by it. So I say many farmers rather than every single farmer, because inevitably, through a process of prioritisation, there will be people who should be coming into the scheme who currently are not in the scheme.
You don't think any particular sector will be disadvantaged for any future schemes?
No, well, I mean, I don't have a set view of how this should be done yet. I want to work with the sector, with representative bodies like the NFU and others, of course, to make sure that the new scheme, it needs to be capped, because there's only a limited amount of money allocated under the budget, so you just can't keep spending it when it's been fully allocated. And I want to make sure that we have thought through the process about who needs the money the most, and make sure they're not disadvantaged just because they're a smaller farm. The current scheme disadvantages smaller farmers, and I don't think it's right to continue in that way.
Thank you. And then my final question, Chair, if I might. The closure of the SFI means that there's no support for land being entered into organic conversion for the first time for 30 years. This support has only just been transferred outside of the countryside stewardship scheme, just several months actually just before. So does the department continue to support organic farming, and will you reinstate support for organic farmers?
Well, I'll ask Emily to comment as well, but just first of all, when you say close the scheme, it was only closed to new applicants. Remember, there are more farmers already in the scheme than at any point in its existence previously. All of those people continue to be paid, including for the actions that you're talking about. So it wouldn't be true to say, for the first time ever, there's no support for organic farming. Or we've got record amounts of funding going in to support organic farming, and indeed to support the transition to a more nature-positive model of farming. And part of the work that we will do to reform the scheme and the farming roadmap more generally is to support farmers to farm in a more nature-positive way, not only because that's good for nature, although that is a good outcome, but also because if farmers can reduce their major input costs, particularly for pesticide and fertiliser, by farming in a different way, then lower input costs, the same yields, means higher profits. And what we're trying to do is ensure that our farming sector becomes much more profitable, so it's resilient well into the future.
Thank you. And just can be very clear about the organic conversion, obviously, because that is the next step that many farmers will be wanting to take. It does take 3 years to convert to organic. So you will be continuing to support that conversion into organic farming certification?
Yes, but I'm very keen that as part of the farming roadmap, we're much more explicit about how we support farmers through that transition to a more nature-positive model of farming, for the two reasons I said before. It's better for nature, but it's also better for farm resilience. Did you want to add anything to that, Emily?
Just that we're aware of the consequences for organic farmers with the SFI application window closing, and with the reformed SFI, there are a lot of decisions to be made about, as the Secretary of State said, about where to allocate money. So that'll be considered.
Yeah, very, very keen to get an answer on that you will be supporting organic farmers and those that wish to transition to organic farming in the future.
Yeah, it is, and the intention is to support more farmers to transition to nature-positive models of farming. That includes organic.
Okay.
Just before I come to Sarah Bull, I mean, you've mentioned a few times the underspend. could you not use some of that underspend, which I recall you right at the start of your tenure managing to secure within the DEFRA budget, to tidy up the somewhat disorderly ending of SFI 24?
Well,
I mean, you've got, from the point of view of farmers, they had the BPS withdrawal accelerated in the budget. They were looking for SFI to compensate for that. It is the smaller farms, the upland farms and the rest of it, who are left with nothing at the end of the day. What's happened to the underspend? Couldn't you?
Well, I mean, I think it was underspent for something like 3 years in a row under the previous government. And at the end of each year, the money that is underspent doesn't just sit in the Treasury, it gets reallocated. So the previous government reallocated it, so it's not there.
It's not there.
No. I mean, there's not just a fund of unspent budget that just waits there until someone thinks of something to do with it. At the end of that year, the Treasury will have reallocated it under the previous government, so it's not there anymore. The thing that we need to get right, and the thing I think we did get right, is I was determined we're not going to allocate money for farmers and then not give it to farmers. So in a way, we did at least get the money out the door. I just wished we'd been able to, and we apologise for the error that happened, to be able to properly notify farmers.
It's fine for those who'd actually started an application, but there are still thousands who'd not even got to the point of starting an application.
Yes, that's right.
For them, they've got no BPS, they've got no prospect of SFI, so if they're going to stay in business, they're going to have to find ways of farming more intensively or whatever. Well, that's surely not what you're wanting.
Well, those are precisely the reasons why we need to reform the way that these farming budgets work. There's not, we don't
jam tomorrow for the farmers who are dealing with that problem now.
Well, we've inherited a scheme that was uncapped and unprioritised, so we have to change that. We'll do it with the sector, but whenever a budget is allocated, we're not going to spend money beyond the allocated budget, which was the implication behind the scheme that we inherited. The government needs to control its own finances, but I want to make sure that the budget that is allocated, every penny of it, is used as effectively as possible to support those farmers who most need it. So that is the purpose of reforming the scheme, and also, actually, of the work that we're doing through the roadmap and the farm profitability unit to ensure that farming becomes more profitable, more resilient, and can attract investment so those businesses thrive into the future.
None of which helps them in the here and now. But Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. Just going back to the SFI, given the change for those who applied, so those 2 months before, I think those ones who are opening it, DEFRA's capped the applications at £9,300 based on the average of all those who applied. But given that the average application for a commercial farm, as opposed to a few meadows or pony paddocks, is about 27,000, can you see why farmers aren't really happy with that 9,300 cap?
Yeah, I can see why farmers aren't happy, but it's very important that we control our budgets. We ended up, this government inherited a £22 billion black hole because the previous government didn't control their budgets. They thought there was a magic money tree, they allocated funding that didn't exist, and they hoped future generations would pay the price for it. We're not going to do that because that doesn't just damage farming, it damages the entire economy. This government will be responsible with taxpayers' money. We're not going to treat it as if it's running out of fashion.
You say about being responsible with taxpayers' money, but in terms of actually giving farmers certainty, in the autumn budget, you, as Chair mentioned, you brought forward the end of BPS early and started the reforms of APR. In November 24, you closed the capital grant schemes and then reopened them in February. In March, you've now closed SFI, and now you've partially reopened them. This doesn't really suggest a government that respects long-term vision, is it?
We inherited a situation where large swathes of British farming is unprofitable. Any sector that can't make profit doesn't have a future. So my intention is to reprioritise these funding schemes so they support farms to transition to models of farming that will enable them to be profitable into the future. Now, my view is that there is an alignment between transitioning to more nature-positive models of farming, therefore reducing your input costs while maintaining yields. We've opened trading opportunities to India, to the United States, to the European Union, all of which we will support farms to take advantage of. We're changing the planning rules so that farmers can more quickly build new facilities to support productivity on their land or convert existing buildings to other uses to get new revenue streams into their businesses. All of this is intended to support farming to become more profitable into the future. We cannot just stand by and continue with a status quo that had left much of this sector on their knees. And the problem, I'm afraid, is not changes to inheritance tax. It's the fact that the whole sector had not been supported with every single lever available to government to become profitable. And my focus is on making this a profitable sector so it has a bright future.
You say about that. Can I ask, have you actually read our government Vision for Farming report yet?
With me here,
Perfect, good. So within that, you talk about supporting, and you rather than just dismissed about the inheritance tax, but obviously that is a huge element of giving long-term support to our farmers to know that they actually have their farms in the future. You talk about diversifying as a means of profitability, but actually they'll get hit by BPR claims under that. So it doesn't quite work together. So will you take our advice and recommendations and speak to the Treasury about delaying the APR and BPR changes to give our farmers that long-term support that they need?
Right. I know that the Treasury is in pretty regular contact with the NFU and other representative bodies, and so am I. So their representations and indeed yours are being heard. But on inheritance tax, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect the farming sector, the agriculture sector, to pay their fair share, just like any other business would. They're only being asked to pay at half the rate of other businesses. Instead of being asked to pay in one go, they can pay it off over 10 years following the death of a farmer. From the Treasury's own statistics, 3/4 would be exempt in any case, but the vast majority of farms will be able to pass on ownership, just as you can with any other valuable asset, 7 years before your likely death, and then pay absolutely nothing at all. So the overwhelming proportion of the sector will not be paying this inheritance tax.
I beg to differ. I think the 75,000 farms that we actually think are affected and all the farming process we've had, you know that is a very different situation.
Do you not think for a moment that those farmers might pass on the farm in their, say, late 60s?
Well, the ones who farmed into their 70s and their 80s, because they were given that advice specifically as being the best means, they maybe don't have 7 years to wait. What happens to them?
I recognise that there is a particular issue at that point.
And what's going to happen for it?
Well, the Treasury has made the announcement. But to be fair, the opposition parties go on as if no farmer will ever hand over ownership while they're in their 60s. The vast majority of them will. And therefore, they will not incur any liability whatsoever.
The NFU and the CLA, as you say, are in constant discussion with Treasury. They came forward with a proposal for clawback over 10 years. Treasury said that would raise much less money. So when they were challenged then, because the analysis that NFU, CLA and others did was that it would raise much the same, the Treasury were asked for their working. It shows why you think it would raise much less money, and they won't release it. That's surely no way to have a respectful dialogue with an industry like this, is it?
Well, I wasn't privy to those particular conversations, so I'm not aware. I'm afraid, Chair. I'm not aware of the details of it, but I do know that the inheritance tax scheme, as it has been designed, will. This is OBR as well. Will raise, I think it's £500 million a year for the initial period. That money is helping to fund the National Health Service and the improvements that we need in mental health support and the mental health hubs that will be placed in every community. There are particularly high levels of mental ill health in rural communities. And I think those that say they don't want to raise the revenue to fund for these benefits need to tell us which of these benefits they would cut as a result of changing it.
I think farmers around the country will hear your words and will be shouting at television screens saying, we already pay our taxes. Sarah, do you have anything?
Well, look, I'm staggered by what you've just said there, because the mental health strain is unbearable, and I've heard farmers telling me this weekend about family members planning things they shouldn't be doing to get away from this. So I am really upset to hear you say it like that, because you're saying this money is going to help mental health. Please consider doing this postponement, which will secure much better mental health services across the mental health for our farmers. I'm staggered. I just want to ask one further question, which is just to do with in the future of farming. Do you really feel, so Ed Miliband really has a big plan for large solar, which is going to take land out of food production, and battery energy storage systems, which are toxic if they catch fire. And in your manifesto, you talked about championing British farming whilst protecting the environment. Do you really feel that plans for these large solar farms and toxic battery energy storage systems are going to secure that?
A few months ago, I launched a consultation on the land use framework, and we will publish the strategy on that in the autumn. What the land use framework does, it was something your party supported while in government, but now opposes in opposition. What the land use framework does, it provides granular data for decision makers, including landowners, about what the best way to deploy their land will be. The information that provides us will help to protect agricultural land, prime agricultural land for food production, and it will identify that land that is most suitable for use for solar farms, so that we can get a win-win here. We need to maintain food security because it's national security. I want to protect the highest producing agricultural land for food production, but we also need to know where are the best places to put solar farms, because we need to we need to support this country to take back control of our own energy from petrochemical dictators like Vladimir Putin, whose actions have caused energy prices to spike massively in this country, damaging farmers as much as anyone else in the country.
I don't think we disagree about getting energy security, that's fine, but solar is only effective about 11% of the time. And I think actually there's other spaces that should be used. Now, you mentioned about the land use framework. One thing that actually from our consultation was that actually there isn't this effective mapping. That was something that was being called for, saying we're not doing enough. There's no talk about proper mapping for where the plans are going to be for solar in the future. But just more to the point, it's a problem now. There's a real tension within that land use framework because it talks about energy, it talks about food security, and it talks about infrastructure. But the problem is that energy is pushing far ahead, and there isn't that proper plan for the food security in place now. And there are like 1.5% of my constituents to be covered in solar farms in the next 2 or 3 years. The energy sector can push faster then the food policy is coming. So can you just see there's this tension? I just don't think we're going to keep up with it.
But I think the argument you're making is why we need the land use framework and the information that it will provide.
But it doesn't address enough. That's the problem.
What you're saying is it's not here already, and that's because the previous government didn't publish it and get on with the work. I think they had 3 false starts where they announced dates it would be launched and they didn't launch it. I did launch it. Now it's out there. If the previous government had done it, then we'd be far further ahead than we are. But in 10 months, I've done what your government didn't do in 14 years. So given that you're making a very strong argument actually for the land use framework, I hope your party will change their position and come back to support
it. Look, we're straying from the subject in hand. Charlie, you want to come in on this, and then Jenny, and then we'll move on.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to go one step back here. I mean, you're here today accepting that a certain section of the farming community are massively unfairly impacted by these changes to APR and BPR. If you did a proper impact assessment, had you done an impact assessment prior to introducing these policies, you could have recognised it and mitigated it. You're now talking about, well, it's fine because farmers in their 60s should pass on their business. Do you not accept that you should look specifically at those cases of farmers who are not in a position to be able to do that and actually change the tune? Then we can start to take some of the emotion out of this for those families that are so horrifically impacted.
Well, you know, the tax policy has been set in the last budget, and that is how it's going to be. And I've already given my reasons why I think it's right to, you know, that every sector of the economy should pay their fair share. The real problem, I think, facing farming, and if you speak to farmers, the reason some of them will say it's difficult to pay inheritance tax is because they say the businesses aren't profitable. Why are the businesses not profitable? Because the previous government didn't do anything to make them profitable. So my intention is to make those businesses profitable. I'm not getting that argument from any other sector where people pay inheritance tax for passing on valuable assets. But in any case, as I said earlier on, the vast majority of farms will be exempt.
Well, you can argue about the vast majority, but quite frankly, making them profit, you're not going to make them profitable by whacking them with a great inheritance tax bill, are you? Even if it's spread over 10 years, you just wipe out 10 years of profit so they don't invest in new buildings, in modernising the farm, new machinery. That affects the wider agricultural economy, and frankly, it just seems to be an absolute disaster. But let's go back to the figures. £520 million per year this is going to raise, and the Prime Minister told the chair to the liaison committee this is a revenue-raising measure. Now, the tax experts that have come in front of this committee and have corresponded with this committee have all said that £520 million is dependent on no changes in behaviour. Now, you're here today saying farmers will change their behaviour to avoid this. So it's not 520 million, is it? It's a hell of a lot less.
I think in the long term that's probably right. But, you know, the arguments have been made, they've been established. The Chancellor has set the tax proposals in the budget, and they will come into force. My focus is on supporting farming to become profitable. I've set up a farming profitability unit under Baroness Batters, the former head of the National Farmers Union, and she is doing work to look at what levers government can use in order to make farming profitable. I think it was irresponsible of the previous government to leave so much of this sector living hand to mouth and not making a profit.
We're going to come on to the profitability.
Okay, sorry, just one more question on that, on the future of farming in general. There's a lot of speculation that the government and Downing Street want to reorganise government departments. Can you categorically tell the committee today there are no discussions that mean DEFRA will not exist in its current guise this time next year?
I'm not aware of any such discussions, no.
Eddie.
You'll have to let me know if you hear anything more.
You can move on to section 4.
Okay, we will move on to section 4 then. On the subject of farm profitability, Andrew, you're going to lead the questioning.
Yeah, I've got to. Look, I'm really pleased you've raised issues around profitability, so I've got a few questions on that. Firstly, look, farming is really important to those of us in the East, and I know you're a friend of Peterborough and the Fens, and I remember a couple of the visits you've done, and one of the early visits pre-election, profitability was one of the big themes that came up from farmers and food producers you met. Particularly both, cut flowers, I think we talked about, people in horticulture, people in food producers. A lot of the talk was around red tape, in terms of getting goods and services out, shipments delayed, wasted money. Really important in terms of profitability. If you could start by just reminding us how the EU deal will help them be more profitable.
Well, I mean, thank you very much for raising profitability, because, I was in private business myself for 16 years. If the business I was in didn't make a profit, that business wouldn't survive. And I think it's extraordinary that so much of the farming sector has been allowed to get into a position where they tell me they're not making profit. Because if that's the case, they can't attract investment, they can't attract new entrants, younger people into the sector. I know that young people growing up on farms, in many cases, watch their parents working all the hours God sends, 6, sometimes 7 days a week, and yet they're not making any money out of it. They choose then not to go into that lifestyle. I want to have intergenerational opportunities for people to get into farming. I want this sector to be profitable so that it's stable and resilient into the future. So I'm really grateful that Baroness Batters has accepted this very important role of leading the farm profitability unit that I've set up in DEFRA. It's a 6-month piece of work, and she is looking with a team around her at how the government can support farming to become more profitable. Now, you're quite right to spot those opportunities in the trade deals that have been signed over the last couple of weeks. You asked about the European Union deal in particular. Since 2018, UK food exports to the European Union have declined by 21%. That is an awful lot of money that could have been going to British food producers, including farmers, by lowering those barriers to trade, by getting food moving across the borders again. And we have trade attachés in the European Union that can help with this through government to make sure the sector is supported. We can get those great high-quality British products into the European markets and get that money supporting investment and growth and employment in UK farming. But there are many, many other things we can do to support farm profitability other than that. One of the things we'll be looking at as we reform the SFI and perhaps other farming schemes as well is how we can support them to become more profitable. The current planning bill going through Parliament will speed up decision making to make it more worthwhile farmers and landowners investing in new facilities to boost food productivity on their land. We're looking at how we can support agri-tech and investment in new technology that can support farming. Just yesterday, I spent a couple of hours, which wasn't long enough, sadly, at the Chelsea Flower Show. But while I was there, I saw some of the robotics that can carry out fruit picking, ultimately at a lower cost than bringing people in from overseas to carry out that work. So there are such opportunities to boost British farming and food production and make it more profitable. I find it extraordinary the government has never focused on that before, but we couldn't have a better person than Baroness Batters, a lifelong farmer herself, a tenant farmer, 10 years president of the NFU, their first female president, leading this piece of work. Huge credibility with the sector, huge insight into the sector, and I am very excited about the work that she is doing to support and boost British farming and food production.
Thank you, Secretary of State. And I think farmers across the fence will welcome any focus in the department around profitability. Now, when you launched the profitability review, you said to the NFU conference, "I will consider my time as Secretary of State a failure if I do not improve profitability for farmers up and down the country." What kind of metrics, what achievements are you hoping will come out of the review?
Well, the metric is quite a simple one. It's their profitability. I think that is one of the, coming from a private sector background myself, that is one of the big differences between the private sector and the public sector. The public sector is quite complex. It tries to do many things and it has many measures, and that's the way it needs to be. In the private sector, there is always this issue about profitability within any business. Farms are private businesses. They need to be profitable to be able to attract new entrants, investment, and to know that they're sustainable financially long into the future. So we will be looking squarely at profitability, because that's how you can support farms and farmers to stand securely on their own 2 feet. They're proud people. That's what they want to do.
Do you think there's a case for one of the outcomes of this review being government departments, particularly DEFRA, need to understand how they bring more business thinking into the way the civil service works?
I think to an extent that's right. I mean, having been operating in both sectors, I don't think you can entirely transfer one sector to the other either way round. They've both got strengths. They can both learn from each other. I don't think one is right, one is wrong. What I want to see through the public sector, and particularly the portion of it that I'm responsible for across the DEFRA group, is a much stronger focus on serving our users, our customers, better than we had before, driving efficiency through the organisation so that I can feel reassured that every penny of taxpayers' money that we spend is spent in the most effective way possible for delivering the outcomes that we are elected to deliver. So I think with focuses like that, you can drive change through the organisation while respecting what's different about the public sector from the private sector.
And one of the discussions we've had and the sector's had is around the choice that's been made by the department, the choice to have it as an internal review rather than an independent review. Can you talk us around your thinking on the choice you made?
Over the piece of work that Baroness Batters is doing. Well, it's kind of akin to the piece of work that Sir John Cunliffe is doing on water, isn't it? Or the piece of work that Dan Corrie did for me on regulatory reform and streamlining regulations, so it's more effective. I've found the best people I could find to lead a piece of work. They're all engaging outwardly before they publish their findings. The findings are published. You, this committee, anyone else can scrutinise them or comment on them, and then we'll take them forward. So that strikes me as the best way, the quickest way to take that work forward.
Brilliant. Can I ask you one final question before I cede back, which is a kind of segue because of time into my broader interest, right, which is around the Fenlands Reservoir that's coming up, because actually water resources, drought conditions, access to water is a huge issue for housing infrastructure and farming in the east and my patch of the world. So it's very welcome the government's given almost a historic green light to the new reservoirs, given the pitiful inheritance of building infrastructure and reservoirs in the UK or England particularly in the thing. Can you give us some reassurances about the timescale for that and make sure that it's not just about getting water resources in place, but also communities like mine will see the jobs and benefit from construction of something as important as a reservoir.
Absolutely. We lack the kind of water infrastructure that this country needs to secure water supplies into the future. We've secured at the end of the price review period investment that would be worth £104 billion over 5 years, and that includes funding for new reservoirs, but also other infrastructure. We get more rain in the west of the country than in the east of the country, so we need better infrastructure to shift the water from where it's falling to other places where it may be required. So the funding that we've secured will enable, private sector funding, I should add, will enable us to build the water infrastructure. The state we were in when we came into office was that by the middle of the 2030s, demand for clean drinking water starts to outstrip supply, and the country would have been looking at rationing. That's something no one wants to see. Because of the investment that we have secured, we can give the country the reassurance they need that that problem has been averted, and that is a very good thing. But for the reasons you're saying, for farming as well, they need access to water. We want to see, in your part of the country as well, the Oxford-Cambridge arc as well. If we're going to get in these new data centres and gigafactories, they're very high users of water. We need to make sure that that water is available for the new housing that will be built right across the country, as well as in your part of the country as well. Water supply, sewage infrastructure needs to be in place, otherwise the development can't go ahead. So we've secured the funding for that, major national infrastructure, to make sure that water doesn't become, for the future, the problem that it was when we were elected last July.
Yeah, coming to water in a few minutes, but first we've still got some more mileage on farming profitability. Jenny, can I?
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of questions, but I'll
Yep.
try to be brief. The grocery code adjudicator, I appreciate it's outside of your remit and your department. It's an issue that many of us in this committee are very passionate about, collectively as a committee, but also individually. What assessment have you made about the effectiveness of the GCA and how it can be strengthened to support farmers and profitability?
A key part of making farms more profitable is making sure that the supply chains are fair.
Yeah.
And the grocery code adjudicator has a role, an important role to play in that. So I'm going to ask my colleague Emily to say something more about this. But the way that we're working through these issues is we've already secured agreements over milk. We're bringing forward milk supply. Before that happened, you had farmers that were being forced, because of unfair contracts and unfair practices, in some cases, to sell milk below the cost of production. That is the path to ruin for any business. We've secured a better position for milk. We're working now for pork products, poultry and eggs to do the same things, bringing forward statutory instruments in order to make sure that we start to see that supply chain fairness. But the GCA has an important part to play within this, but it's not the only regulator in that sector that we need to be supporting. I want to add anything?
I haven't got loads to add, but we talked about this when I was here with the Minister a few weeks ago, but obviously the GCA regulates the supermarkets and their price at that point. The agricultural supply chain adjudicator has a different role, which the Secretary of State has just been setting out. And at the moment, with the fair dealing regulations being in the middle of being consulted on and then implemented, we think that is going to have a significant impact, particularly for primary producers. Yeah. So I think we need to think of them as a piece, the grocery code adjudicator and the agricultural supply chain adjudicator. The GCA, there is a formal review out at the moment, which the Department for Business and Trade have just published. So we will obviously be very interested in what they conclude about that. We do think it's a very significant and important body in terms of protecting farmers' incomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And Secretary of State, can I ask you, do you acknowledge that supermarkets are letting down farmers and are a big part of the issues that we face in trying to tackle profitability in farming, specifically supermarkets?
I mean, I think there are lots of problems in the supply chain, and I think it's unfair to point to just one part of it. Supermarkets want to support the producers of origin because they need those producers of origin to be successful businesses if they're going to keep supplying the products that the supermarkets want to sell. There are problems in the whole supply chain. It's not just the point of origin and the point of sale. So in looking at how we make the system fair, we need to make sure that it's fair to everybody. The supermarket chief execs that I've spoken to support that just as much as the farm representatives that I've spoken to.
I think our farmers in our communities would say that it's not their practices, farm washing, and that they're often forced into agreements that they have very little negotiating power with. So absolutely. I would urge you to hold that in your mind when you're having those conversations. I'll move on from that. Back British farming, British produce. There's lots of ways that we can support profitability. Some is rhetoric, some is reform, some is investment. Rhetoric costs nothing. Do you back buying British to support farmers and profitability?
Yeah. Just on your point on unfair contracts, that is exactly the point I was making about milk. It's not fair that the producer of origin should be forced into a contract where if there's a spike in costs, as happened, say, with the energy increases, it's the producer that bears the cost of that. It's not shared fairly. So I do agree with your point. On Buy British, yes. We want to do more to support the public sector, aspects of the public sector, where they have significant contracts for food buying, to spend more of it on buying British. That's taxpayers' money. I think taxpayers would be pleased to know that their money is being used to support British produce where that can be done.
Great. It would be wonderful if we could see a DEFRA-led campaign to back British and buy British. I think it's something that communities are really proud of to support their local farm and produce. But I think it's something that when we speak to our constituents, that everybody feels proud of our British produce, and it's no less important now than it was yesterday. My final question, if I may, is planning and infrastructure bills coming up. We've heard a bit about it earlier from the energy perspective. I've made an amendment myself to it that we in Suffolk Coastal, a huge amount of energy infrastructure projects going on. Some of it is going to be CPO'd on farming land. There seems to be a lack of awareness that when you lay large energy infrastructure cables underground, anything that's less than 1.8 metres in depth below the land means that that land won't be able to be used for arable farming again. So I put forward an amendment to request that when cables are laid in ground, that we make sure it's always to a minimum depth of 1.8. I've got experience in my constituency of cables being laid to less than 1 metre, which means that land is taken out of agriculture, which obviously continues to threaten food security. Do you have any comments on that? And could you also commit to that point of where we are laying very critical and necessary energy infrastructure, that going forward it takes in land use and farming sustainability into its consideration?
I think you make some very fair points there, actually. And I'm happy to have conversations with my colleagues. It would be in MHCLG, who are leading on the planning and infrastructure bill. But I do think we need to do, as I was saying with my earlier comments about the land use framework, we want to support agricultural land being able to produce as much food as it can, and then put other infrastructure where it can be more appropriately located. There will be some areas, as you're saying, where the two have to work together, but we should be looking for the best outcome on both sides and not disadvantaging food production.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, look, we're almost at 12:20. We've still got really important stuff on water to deal with, but Sarah and Jane want to come in with very quick questions. I'll maybe take them both and then come to you, Secretary of State. Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. I'm really pleased to hear that Baroness Batters is leading on the farm profitability review. Could you just quickly tell me what resources and expertise is available to support her work? You also mentioned that it's a 6-month review. That doesn't really seem enough time to get under the skin of this and put meat on the bones of the work that she's doing. My second question is that around farmers' profitability and farmers able to add value at the farm gate. I've been doing a lot of work on small abattoirs. They are closing at an alarming rate at the moment. can you make sure that they are part of the farming roadmap, because they are key players in ensuring that farmers are able to find different routes to market to help ensure their profitability?
Yeah. If you can hold these for a second, and Jane, if we can get your question.
Mine was just very quickly about the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. Obviously, Natural England are going to have responsibility for environmental delivery plans, so writing them and also delivering them. I was going to ask about the resource within Natural England to be able to cope with that. Can it cope with that? Where will the extra resource come from to enable it to cope with that?
Yeah, I'll invite Emily to comment on the Natural England point. Is that in your remit?
Really? I can do that.
Oh, sorry, wrong one. David will comment on that. On your points, Baroness Batters has a small team that she's working with, and they're doing a lot of outreach work into the sector. It's hard to think of anyone who's better networked in the farming sector than Baroness Batters. I think 6 months, it is enough time to get a piece of work done, and if anyone can do it in that time, Baroness Batters can. She is a woman on a mission. She's like a whirlwind of energy, and she's enthusing the people around her. And I'm very, very confident that she would be able to do the work in that time frame. I feel sure she would. She's not slow in sharing her opinions on things. If she felt that wasn't enough time, she would have let me know. So I'll give her head, and we'll see what she's coming up with. I'm getting regular reports back from her, and I'm speaking to her regularly as well. I know she's looking at the issue about small abattoirs. She's raised that with me. I'll give her time to draw her own conclusions, and then she will publish her report, and we'll see what she's got to say, and then I'm sure we collectively can have a further conversation about how we take that work forward. Yeah, David, any EDPs?
All abattoirs?
Yeah, sorry, that's in scope.
Right, yeah. David?
Yes, on Natural England, so they would have that delivery role in relation to the environmental delivery plans. They'd also be responsible for a number of other delivery measures in the bill, so the Nature Restoration Fund, if approved by Parliament. As you'd expect, we're in a spending review negotiation right now with the Treasury. Clearly a big part of our planning for that spending review is about making sure that we would be ready to implement the provisions in that piece of legislation. So I can't give you a number right now because that's a live negotiation with the Treasury, but once the final outcome of the spending review is announced in June, we should be able to confirm the final position. But clearly the resourcing Natural England to do the job properly is a high priority for us.
Right. Moving on to water, Thames Water specifically. Helena, can I?
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to start with some general questions, actually. Secretary of State, there is huge public anger about the behaviour of the water industry, and we've been leading an inquiry as a committee into the water industry, and time after time, as we've been calling the water bosses in, we've heard about this bad behaviour, we've heard about them spending huge money on legal bills, challenging customers only to concede there is in fact pollution in the places the customers and the citizen scientists said there was. We heard about shocking treatment of staff, we heard about bonuses being paid despite massive failings in the water companies. So we wanted to just share a couple of examples of this behaviour with you and also ask some wider questions. To start with Thames Water, who were in front of our committee last week. And what we heard from them was more evidence of this bad behaviour. But in their case specifically, they had put back around 100 critical infrastructure projects a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, and instead used that money that had been earmarked in the price review agreed by Ofwat in 2019, earmarked money for critical infrastructure projects, instead allocated for bonuses and paying dividends. At the same time in that period, we saw a 40% increase in pollution by Thames Water last year. And people are rightly very shocked to hear these kinds of experiences. That can't be right, can it? That at the same time as having a 40% increase in pollution incidents, they put back critical infrastructure projects that could have been fixing pipes. And now, looking forward, they're telling us despite this increase in pollution, they still want to pay bonuses to their top leadership at Thames Water.
Yeah, the situation in the water sector had become intolerable. I think that's fair to say. The system was failing everyone. It was failing customers, it was failing the environment, it was failing investors, actually.
as well. That's why I've asked Sir John Cunliffe to lead the piece of work. We're due to see the interim report later this month, actually, to look at regulation and the regulators and look at how we can reset it so that the problems that we're allowed to grow in the way and lead to the outcomes you've just described can never happen again. We look forward to his report on that. I've taken some action already, even ahead of Sir John's work. It was 7 days after the general election. I had the water company chief executives in my office, and we agreed that money earmarked for investment would be ring-fenced, so it can never again be diverted in the way you've just described for payment on bonuses and dividends. That was absolutely wrong, that was able to continue for so long. Any company that does that again in future will refund that money to customers through a discount on their bills. So they have a huge disincentive to continue the kind of practices that you're describing that were very, very, very worrying. Customers are right to be furious at the rate of bonuses that chief execs were paying themselves for overseeing often catastrophic levels of failure. You know, the level of pollution, of water pollution in this country, which hit a record high last year, is nothing short of scandalous. And the people responsible for failing to take action to correct that, in the eyes of the great British public, it offends against a sense of fair play. You should not be richly rewarded for overseeing failure. So in the Water Special Measures Bill, which passed through Parliament earlier this year, the regulator has been given the power to ban the payment of unfair and undeserved bonuses. And indeed, just over the last few days, we've seen a very unfortunate situation where Thames Water appeared to be trying to circumvent that ban by calling their bonuses something different, so they continue to pay them. I'm very happy indeed that Thames have now dropped those proposals. It was the wrong thing to do. It offends against their own customers' sense of fair play. We need to reset this sector so the failings you've described can never happen again.
So the public were rightly furious to hear from the Thames bosses last week this assertion that they might still take their bonuses in the forthcoming year, or retention payments as they wanted to call them. You're confirming to the committee today that's off the table. They won't be doing that.
They won't be doing that. No. I was very clear in public. The government would take any action necessary to prevent them trying to circumvent the ban that we've now put in law. They've now withdrawn their proposal to make those payments.
That's good to hear. One of the things that Sir Adrian, the chairman of Thames Water, said when he was before us and he was trying to justify the paying of these retention payments or bonuses by any other description was that the creditors of Thames Water had said it was a condition of the loan that they had to allocate money for the top leadership to get retention payments, which many members of the public were rightly furious to hear about. And actually, since that evidence to our committee, we've seen documents filed in the High Court that suggest Sir Adrian misled in his wording, and he's written to us in a letter we've published as a committee saying that he may have misspoken when he said that. This is very serious behaviour from the bosses of Thames Water at our committee.
I agree with you, and I think the committee has its own authority and powers, and we'll deal with that in the way that the committee feels is appropriate. I think what the government is doing, we've enacted the Water Special Measures Bill now. I took those actions within 7 days of the election, including ring-fencing customers' money, so it can't be diverted to be misspent on bonuses and dividends when it should be spent on fixing our broken water system and the broken pipes that are leaking sewage at such levels into our waterways. But perhaps the most significant of all these reforms in the long term will be the work that Sir John Cunliffe is carrying out. I know you're as excited to see his interim report due in just a couple of weeks' time, and where he's got to with that report. We'll then have his final report when he's had feedback on the interim
towards the end of June, perhaps early July, but that will be making his final recommendations on how we reset a regulatory system that is absolutely broken and which has led to the catastrophe of record levels of sewage poisoning our waterways. We cannot allow that to continue. This government will not allow that to continue. And I think it's one of the most important pieces of work this government as a whole can do, which is to restore the cleanliness of our rivers, lakes and seas.
And on the point of Thames Water more broadly, obviously there has been lots of speculation about Thames Water. How confident are you that Thames Water will avoid special administration?
Well, Thames is a private company, and it is for them to sort out their own finances. As you will be aware, because it's in the public domain, they're currently in conversations with their creditors about new sources of equity and the status of those creditors' debt. It's for them to manage those conversations. Government is closely monitoring the situation, as we should, but they need to be given the space to get on with that within the regulatory environment as it exists.
Moving on more broadly to some of the themes we've heard in our inquiry into the water sector, as well as pollution, we've heard about a number of incidents where customers were left without water supply. We had a very serious incident in Devon where a parasite in the water supply meant customers were actually getting sick from the water supply and obviously without supply too. And there we heard from the boss of South West Water that she thought it was acceptable to evade media interviews during that period. Shocking behaviour. And then we heard from Southern Water, which serves my own constituency, about 2 major water outages in my constituency, in Hastings and in Rye, and the impact that had. People left up to 5 days without water, not able to go to the toilet, wash, drink, prepare food. So there's 2 questions I'd like to ask you about water outages. You will be aware that this is governed by the Guaranteed Standards of Service, a framework this government is committed to updating, and the compensation level has been very low historically that has been paid. This government has committed to raising that compensation. Could you give us an update on the timeline for that? And linked to that point, as we've been hearing these examples as a committee, what really comes through is that aside from the specification about the level of compensation a customer might get after the incident, there doesn't seem to be set out any framework around what reasonable provisions a customer could expect from a water company when they are left without water. So, for example, if you are on a delayed flight, there's very clear guidance that after 3 hours you're entitled to this and after 6 hours to this. Is there scope for perhaps the government to look at setting out some guidelines to water companies on what companies should provide while they are trying to get that supply back on, like portaloos, showers, provision to prepare food, things like that? Can you comment on the timeline for raising the compensation and that wider point?
Well, I'll in a moment bring in my colleague here, who I'm sure will have more detailed response to give you than me. But of course, I had the opportunity to meet some of the businesses down in the beautiful town of Rye when you invited me down there, and to hear their frustration at the extent of the water outages, the lack of communication, the lack of alternative provision, and ultimately the lack of compensation or even an apology for what had gone on. So clearly things need to change. You're a ferocious champion of water consumers, and they need people to be out there advocating for a circumstance which has been completely unacceptable for water consumers. So we are increasing rates of compensation. We are looking to improve those water standards in the way that you have described. I believe the SI is due to be laid very shortly on that, but my colleague here will have more detail.
Yes, so the standards, we've announced what we intend to do in terms of the doubling of the compensation, but also extending the circumstances in which compensation can be offered. So, for example, the case you referred to in Brixham, where boil notices were issued. Previously, that wouldn't have been eligible for compensation. Now it will. In terms of the timing of the SI, we expect to lay the SI imminently, so within the next few weeks. So it's almost ready, and we're just looking for a slot to lay that, so that will be literally within the next few weeks. If I may address your second question around provision during an incident. So water companies should be making provision, for example, for bottled water provision. They should know who vulnerable customers are in their area, and they should have a plan for targeting vulnerable customers, and also facilities like hospitals, including tankering and so on. But if there are any improvements we need to make sure that's codified or formalised in any way, we can look at that further.
We've heard time and again that the water supplies don't get delivered to vulnerable customers, people get missed, and it's very chaotic. It often causes traffic gridlock when they try and provide water supplies because they don't open enough water stations. But I think it's more than just bottled water that people need. When we're talking about a prolonged crisis of 36, 48, 72 hours, it affects people's ability to use the toilet safely, it affects their ability to prepare food in a clean way. So I think the department should look at a broader set of guidelines about what should be provided.
Yeah, so they should make provision commensurate with the sort of scale and severity of the incident, but very happy to pick up those points and look at those further.
Thank you. And then one final question, if I may, Chair. With the warm weather that we are experiencing at the moment, we are hearing warnings of a drought. Very serious situation for the country to be facing, particularly for consumers, but also for our farmers, as we've heard from colleagues earlier. How, as Secretary of State, how will DEFRA ensure that our country is prepared for a drought and our water companies are taking the necessary steps that they need to prepare?
Yep. So we're engaging regularly with the EA over the state of the weather. Of course, we haven't had rain for quite a long time this early in the year. That's worrying. We're not at the point where there's a drought yet, but the water companies are required to have 5-year drought plans that they refresh every 5 years. So those plans are in place to make sure that appropriate action can be taken when it needs to be taken. Of course, the additional, for the longer term, the improved water infrastructure that we'll be building as a result of the £104 billion that we secured at the close of the most recent price review period will mean that the country will be better placed to deal with this in the long term. Because that infrastructure has not been invested in over recent years, you are right to highlight the importance of making sure that preparations are as good as they can be, just in case we get to the position where we are facing a drought. I wonder, David, do you want to comment any further on that?
Not a huge amount to add. I mean, a bit of context. I mean, this is the driest spring in England since 1956. Currently, it's areas that are reliant on surface water, so that's typically the north and the centre of England. They're at what's called prolonged dry weather status. Areas that are more reliant on groundwater, currently at normal status, but clearly we are upping our contingency planning for the summer. So the National Drought Group, which the EA convened, but actually the Water Minister attended in May, we've upped the frequency of that. That brings together the water companies, local authorities, agencies involved in drought planning. So all of that work will keep a close eye on the situation running into the summer. And then beyond that, as the Secretary of State said, it's about investing in the long-term resilience of the water infrastructure, but water efficiency, water demand, also a really important part of that picture. So, plans to bring forward, for example, water efficiency labelling for water-intensive appliances, all of those measures will also be an important part in terms of increasing overall water resilience in the future.
Thank you.
Jane, you wanted to come in?
Yes, just very quickly. Helen and May have covered this when I was out, but we were struck by the fact that only one preferred bidder has been accepted by Thames Water, KKR, and that they seem to have been trying to negotiate with Ofwat to reduce some of the penalties they may face for some of the breaches of the rules. Is this acceptable?
Well, I mean, they're a private company. It's for them to
negotiate
work
with the
with protects that invest. Not that aspect of it. It's for them to look at who they want to bring in as a potential investor to resolve some of the financial challenges of their own making that they are dealing with
It's more about them being let off penalties as well,
at the
to
moment,
make themselves more saleable.
But they will do that within the rules. And the rules are very clear, the regulations are very clear, and my intention is that Thames will follow the regulations and the rules as they apply to everyone else.
Josh, will we move on to the animal welfare questions at this stage so we get sufficient time?
Thank you very much, Chair. I think this is something that obviously has a lot of interest out there. I'm sure your inbox is as full as ours of passionate constituents who want to push the government to do as much as possible on animal welfare. Now, I'm aware, of course, that the government is supporting several private members' bills which will strengthen animal welfare. Yep. But I would like to touch first, if I may, on what the government's doing to improve enforcement of existing animal welfare legislation. In particular, enforcement of the Hunting Act is raised by my constituents quite often. Yep. So as we seek to build on that bit of legislation, are you as confident that it's as effective in 2025 as it was in 2005? And what more can we do to make sure that it is enforced?
No, good points. Enforcement, of course, is carried out by a range of partners and agencies and organisations, and DEFRA maintains very close contact with them to ensure it's happening in the way that it should. Not least the Home Office, who have oversight of the police, who have a role in this, and the Ministry of Justice as well, but also NGOs like the RSPCA have a role to play in this, and there will be others as well. So we closely monitor what is happening with enforcement of that kind, and where issues are brought to our attention, then we can take action on that. I mean, I don't know if you want to dig into the hunting aspect of that further. I can comment more if you want me to.
Okay. I think one particular pressure on animal welfare legislation in general is on local authorities, because they've got a huge role in enforcing this, and the pressures on them are obviously clear for all to see. They often can't maintain proper enforcement and deterrent by themselves. Yeah. For example, the British Veterinary Association have highlighted a real postcode lottery on this. Yeah. The fact that nearly half of all English councils don't have a single dedicated animal welfare officer. Are we at risk, do you think, of getting to a point where the enforcers can't meet their statutory duties, which could embolden the criminals and undermine the credibility of the laws that we've already got?
I mean, I think, local authorities have many statutory duties, and for some years now, including the ones that you're describing, for some years now, they've been saying that funding has become so inadequate that they may not be able to carry out those statutory duties, both on animal welfare but also on issues like child welfare, support for the elderly and the disabled, all areas where they have statutory obligations, but resources have shrunk so low after 14 years of austerity under the previous government that they can no longer guarantee they're able to meet those obligations. Now, in the budget last year, local authorities were given an above inflation increase in their funding, so I'm pleased to see that situation start to turn around, but you can't fix a problem that had become that profound overnight. But it is an area that I and my team and my ministers have been focusing on, and we've been engaging with local authorities to make sure that they are carrying out their obligations where they are required to.
May I just add one thing, which is that there has been a change in the law so that local authorities can pursue more fixed penalty notices rather than full prosecutions. Obviously, the burden of doing a full prosecution is very resource intensive. Yeah. So recognising that doesn't solve the funding issue the Secretary of State describes, hopefully that will mean they can work a little bit more efficiently. Yeah. The Animal and Plant Health Agency also does do some enforcement work on animal welfare.
It's really welcome to hear. I mean, my local authority, Cannock Chase District Council, has got a really good record on this. Really, really strong set of officers who do pursue things. So the fact that they're going to have that kind of strengthened powers to deal with it is really welcome. I think, Chair, Helen, I wanted to ask one question on this, and then if I could come back in briefly, that would be much appreciated.
Okay, I'll do that.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, in the manifesto you committed to banning trail hunting, ending the use of snare traps and ending puppy farming. Can you give the committee an update on these commitments?
Yep, we remain committed to all of that. Of course, there's still 4 years of the Parliament to run, so we will find the appropriate time in the parliamentary and legislative schedule to make sure that those can happen. They remain commitments. We only have the schedule for the current session, not for future sessions, but we will make sure those all get carried out. They're very important. They're in the manifesto for that reason. We were elected on that manifesto and we will deliver it.
Thank you very much. We've got an upcoming report, we understand, into the phasing out of using animals in research. And that's obviously much awaited. But could you tell us a bit about how that's going to balance that really lofty ambition with existing scientific capabilities and resources in the UK?
Yeah. I mean, this is interesting because it's a cross-departmental agenda. DEFRA has a role in it, so does the Home Office, so does DCIT. The departments are working together on a strategy that will be published later this year. So we'll see more of the detail when it comes out. I think it's probably best I don't anticipate what might be in it. I'm personally very committed to this. I've spoken to a lot of the companies that are required to carry out testing on animals, and in many cases they will tell you they only carry it out because they're required to carry it out by regulation and legislation, not because it adds anything of value that they can use in developing better or safer products. So clearly this is an area of law that requires reform. So I'm looking forward, as I'm sure many other animal lovers will be looking forward, to this this strategy being published so that we can scrutinise it, discuss it and then enact it, so we can get to a much more sensible situation around the use of animals in science, research and testing.
Absolutely. I think it's another example of where technology and innovation has moved on at pace and legislation perhaps hasn't kept pace with that, so that's really welcome.
Completely agree.
Do you know if the strategy will include a proposed date for achieving that phasing out, and will it have milestone targets along the way for research?
Those are all very sensible things to look for in it. I haven't seen it, so I can't answer those questions. But any sensible strategy has an implementation plan attached to it, so that we know what needs to change in law, when it will change. Those companies who are being required to carry out this kind of testing need to know when they can stand those facilities down, and that will take some planning work and preparation on their part. So I would be looking for that in the strategy when it comes forward.
Okay, we'll definitely be looking forward to that. So just finally, can I raise another animal welfare policy which seems to be stuck in departmental limbo at the moment, and that is labelling on welfare standards on food products. So it wasn't a commitment in the manifesto that we both stood on, but the previous government did do lots of work on this. Has to be said, it was very long and drawn out, including a public consultation which concluded more than a year ago. Could you commit that DEFRA will respond to that consultation as quickly as possible? And could you shed any light on how you're going about balancing the views and interests of animal welfare organisations on one side and then farmers, abattoirs and the wider supply chain on the other?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a response, but my colleague here, who has some professional expertise in that sector, might have something to add to it. But we're looking at food labelling as part of the food strategy. That's a piece of work that we're carrying out with stakeholders from right across the food and drink sector, without any fixed view about at this stage about where we need to get to. I'm not in favour of compulsion around what consumers choose to buy and eat. I'm very much in favour of giving the best possible information in the most usable way to consumers, and this is clearly part of the information that would inform those consumer choices. So as part of the food strategy, we'll be looking at that aspect of it, as well as many other aspects. The system that we currently have, we can look and see if there are better ways to do it. Other countries do it in different ways. So we'll take all of that in the round, and proposals will come forward. Emily.
So, I mean, it is interesting how in the UK there is a significant consumer appetite for strong animal welfare standards, and you can see that with the amount of free-range eggs that get bought. I think we're at something like 60% of eggs bought in the UK are free-range. It's very different in France, much less. So there is a huge appetite. In terms of the consultation that was done, I will discuss with ministers about how to take that forward. I think the question of how it plays out in the food label is significant. There are a lot of pressures on a food label. It's a very contested document that has a lot of information on. I think the thing we should need to remember as well, though, is that there are third-party certification standards like Red Tractor, which look at animal welfare standards too. So we need to make sure that we've got the right mechanism for providing consumers with that information about high animal welfare.
Absolutely. I just think it's quite a muddled landscape at the moment. So people sort of understand what Red Tractor means, but perhaps not from a welfare angle. And then you've got organic standards, which are obviously different, and you've got the Soil Association and the EU organic standards. You've got the RSPCA Assured. Now Waitrose have introduced their own sort of voluntary labelling scheme, so it's becoming quite confusing and cluttered, I think, for consumers. And so anything we can do to sort of, like you said, maybe not overtake that and sort of mandate things, but bring that information in a format that's a lot easier for consumers to understand, I think would be really welcome, because it's kind of building on what's already happening, and as you said, huge appetite amongst consumers. Do we have a timescale for the food strategy at all? Appreciate it.
It's due to be published in the after the summer recess, isn't it?
We're hoping to do an update before the summer. I mean, it will also be a framework, but there will also be a series of policy announcements that will need to flow from it. So I wouldn't see it as a one-off event.
That's it on animal welfare, Chair. Do you want to move on to...
We've got a couple of quick interventions before we come to your next section. Charlie, you wanted to come in, Gina?
Yeah, I'm just actually to follow up to what Josh just said. I mean, I think we talk about the move to free-range eggs. That was a decision made by retailers in response to consumers and didn't require the intervention of government, and we need to bear that in mind, actually, because I think it's not necessarily the way forward. But I just wanted a brief segue just to precision breeding and gene editing, just very briefly, because we kind of missed it earlier, and it's slightly connected. A lot of progress has been made by the last government, by this government, particularly on plant gene editing. It's a huge opportunity in terms of farm profitability, food security, etc. Are you concerned that the EU deal and dynamic alignment and the EU's different position on gene editing puts that at risk?
I'm very optimistic, actually. I recognise, first of all, what you've said about the previous government and this government. That is a very important agenda. It's very important for my ambitions to make the farming sector more profitable, that they should be able to get higher yields from the crops that they're growing. The way that we've managed to feed the world's growing population over the last 100 years is by improving crop yields. So there's further to go. And gene editing, precision breeding is a key part of that. The deal with the EU that was signed yesterday includes the opportunity, the door remains open, to seek exemptions so that the gene editing programme in the UK can continue. I think it's fair to say that this country is ahead of Europe on this. There are many parts of the European Union where they're looking to us for leadership, so we have their support in this, but it's an area that the agreement leaves open. There are some further negotiations that need to take place, but this is one of those areas where I'm very optimistic that we'll get an outcome that will benefit British farming in the way that we need to on this agenda.
Yeah, just implore you to keep pushing that, because we don't want to allow this deal to pull us back into...
Pushing that very hard. I've given a commitment to the NFU President on precisely that just yesterday.
Almost as if we could influence other countries in Europe by cooperating with the food, I think.
I know, incidentally, that the NFU President made those points to Maros Sefcovic at Downing Street yesterday, so he's under no uncertainty about the importance of this and the strength of feeling.
Sarah.
Just moving back to kind of animal welfare in the countryside, it's seeing a huge rise in illegal gangs, hare coursing, badger baiting, trespassing on farmers' land. At the same time, coupled with a reduction in rural crime units in Somerset, for example, we've got 4 officers in the rural crime unit. Quite often, they're dispatched off to other departments where there's a need. How is the department working with the Home Office to provide protection to farmers? Obviously, at the same time, then supporting animal welfare.
Of course, and rising crime in rural areas should concern all of us, and the government is putting together the first ever rural crime strategy cross government. So DEFRA is working with the Home Office and the MOJ to look at how we can make sure that those issues are properly addressed and are being tackled, and that will include an increase in police officers in rural areas to help make sure that the resources are there to detect and then prosecute those who are responsible for what's going on.
Josh, we're going to come back now to the circular economy.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really grateful to have the opportunity to speak on this, because it was something that we didn't manage to get to when we last had you in front of the committee because of certain other things that we talked about at length. So we will, as a committee, shortly be launching an inquiry into the circular economy, and that's something that you previously told us is a very big priority for your department. We understand that the Circular Economy Task Force is working on a strategy, which hopefully will be published in the autumn. Is that still on track?
Yes. First of all, I'm really pleased to hear that the committee is looking at the circular economy. It's a new agenda for UK government, and it's something I'm very keen that we should push and promote. It will be very beneficial for the environment because it will enable us to reduce waste, and that's going to be a good thing. But it also means, with international supply chains much more volatile, there are materials already in this country that we can reuse to reduce dependency on those more insecure international supply chains. And ultimately, it will be cheaper to reuse those materials than to bring new materials into the country. And any reduction in input costs for business is an increase in profitability. And that's something we want to see underpinning economic growth. Contributes to the net zero agenda of this government as well. So many wins. Including investment in regional economies with the new facilities that we'll need to repurpose and reuse those materials. We've fallen behind many of our nearest neighbours in continental Europe and beyond. There's an opportunity for us to not just catch up but overtake them on the circular economy. DEFRA's own figures show that there is a potential 16 billion per annum boost to the economy from moving to a circular economy. That is something we want to see our country and every region of our country benefit from. So under the chairmanship of Andrew Mortlett, who is the chair of the Circular Economy Task Force, they are now working sector by sector, engaging with the sectors. It's important that different economic and manufacturing sectors engage and lead this agenda. We need them to own it if it's going to work. They've selected for prioritisation those sectors where the potential for economic growth is the greatest. So that's chemicals, plastics, construction, textiles, electrical, agri-food and transport. They're now working with those sectors to start to develop roadmaps towards zero waste. The way that would work would be by gradual regulatory incremental change at a pace that the sector is comfortable with and wants to work with in order to get to zero waste and in ordering each sector and the wider economy to benefit in the way that I just described. I think, again, when are we due the strategy on this? Who's got that one?
I'm not sure of the timing of that one. We might have to come back on that.
Yeah, we can write back to you, but yeah, I mean, it's very good that it's up and running and it's moving forward. Elements of it we've already been working through as well. So we've got the bottle deposit return scheme. The legislation is already in place for that. That comes into force in 2027. Extended producer responsibility is underway now, and the oversight mechanism, which is industry-led, is about to be set up as well. But there's much more to the circular economy than even just those two quite eye-catching pieces of legislation.
Absolutely. It's encouraging to hear that the conversations with each sector are kind of happening as part of this overall strategy, because hopefully we can knit all of that together, because sometimes these sort of sector by sector conversations can be quite siloed and you miss the sort of wider gains that you get from the whole system. So that's really encouraging. Just lastly, spoiler alert, our first piece of work as part of this inquiry will be on the Global Plastics Treaty.
Yes.
There are obviously talks on this planned, we understand, in Geneva in August.
Yeah.
What are the prospects, you think, of a successful outcome from that? And what will the government be doing to lead the way on this, as the UK government has done so many times in the past, and set that level of ambition as high as possible?
Yeah, well, it was disappointing that at the conference in Busan, South Korea, towards the end of last year, there wasn't agreement reached on the treaty, although there was a statement on polymers,
signed by, I think it was over 100 countries, and the UK was party to that. But we've continued to engage with partners since Busan, looking towards Geneva in August. You're right to say the UK plays a leading role in this. We have a very well-respected negotiating team. And you know, it's in the nature of these things. You have to remain optimistic in the run-up to the decision point, and I am optimistic. I think there was a lot of goodwill. Couldn't quite get it over the line in South Korea, but we're all doing what we need to do with partners to make sure that happens at Geneva in the summer.
Fantastic. All power to your elbow for that. We'll look out for that. Thanks, as well.
You're here. Sarah, did you...
Yeah, just coming in, if I may, on the back of that. Obviously, great stuff, but do you feel that unless there's a global plastics treaty has a legally binding target attached to it, if there isn't, do you think that will be a failure?
I think it needs to be as robust as we can get agreement behind. From memory but I think the amount of plastic entering the oceans by 2050 will be 4 or 5 times what it was in 2016. That's shocking when you think of the images we've all seen of animals being strangled in the water, sea animals being strangled in the water because of plastic that has ended up there. We can't tolerate this destruction of the marine environment to continue. So the UK will be pushing for the strongest possible outcome we can get, with other countries being willing to sign up to it.
And if I may, Chair, one final question. Glass is often seen, or it is a highly recyclable material, but many businesses, particularly in my constituent Glastonbury and Somerton, I've got lots of traditional cider makers and brewers. I won't list them all because there's so many of them, but they're really worried about the impact of EPR that's going to have on their business and the delay. What assurances can you provide them to give them the certainty that they need to be able to plan properly?
Yeah, well, we're working with organisations in the sector. It's a sector-led process that we're pursuing now. I think we get the final fee structures will be available later this year, which are likely to be lower than the fees that were published earlier this year. But the department is engaging with the whole sector, listening to their concerns, and we'll do everything we can to support them through what is inevitably a period of change, but it is the right thing to do. I think the public agree with the principle that the polluter should pay. The public want to see less waste and more reuse of materials. Ultimately, I think this is something that the sector will benefit from.
Yeah. And then just kind of last question on that. Look, the EPR fees are going to be going to the local authorities. Yeah. What assurances can you give me that there will be kind of ring-fenced, that money will be ring-fenced to make sure that it's spent on waste-related activities?
Yeah, we're in discussions with local authorities and MHCLG about that right now. I think the key thing to focus on with anything of this kind is that the outcomes are what we expect to see. So that's the priority for me, but we need to make sure that the money that is allocated to local authorities is spent in the way that it was intended to be.
Of course, to come back to where we started, it would be remiss of me if I were not to point out at this stage that the industrial scale gillnating that I spoke about is a massive contributor to plastic pollution in the oceans. Whole nets just abandoned. It's unsustainable for all sorts of reasons. We are, however, out of time. We've not quite covered everything we wanted to talk about, but we've covered just about everything. You're out of time, and the effects of my lemsip are well and truly worn off. So we will thank you for your attendance, for your engagement today. We do appreciate it. And we shall no doubt return to some of these subjects in the future. But for the moment, we are concluded for today.